Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin friends and Formula One fans on Sprint Saturday. First of all, however, we want to deal with another topic, a topic that has already come up before the sprint. Our colleagues from Auto, Motor and Sport first reported on it, and the FIA has since confirmed that there is once again a right of review. It's a big deal because it's about the US Grand Prix a week and a half or almost 2 weeks ago, and Haas is taking action against the result. With a right of review, there's this deadline of 14 days, which was just about met. We've already had another race in Mexico in the meantime, and now we're going back again to the race in Aston. But what exactly is it about? It's about a very tiresome topic. You probably already know what I'm talking about, namely track limits. Alexander Albon was still under investigation after the US Grand Prix. He had already received a penalty in the race, and then after the race another situation was investigated because he was allegedly often off the track in turn 6. But then he was acquitted for lack of evidence. In the steward's ruling, it was quite interestingly explained that they had already viewed video footage, but no trackside cameras. This whole discussion was reignited in Mexico, where it was suddenly said that Sergio Perez was off the track in turn 6 on almost 20 laps, and then it emerged that the track camera there was not set up in such a way that track limits could be monitored. And then it turned out that there was more. It wasn't just Perez, it wasn't just Albon, there were perhaps a few more drivers. And that's exactly why Haas took a closer look at the situation. Of course, Nico Hülkenberg finished in 11th position after Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc were disqualified, and if you could perhaps do something with penalties, you might still be able to score points. Specifically, it's about Sergio Perez, Alexander Albon, Logan Sargent and Lance Stroll, who are to be penalized retrospectively. A very crucial point is that once a driver has collected 3 warnings, there are 5 seconds for each further infringement of the track limits, i.e. 5 seconds for the 4th infringement, 5 seconds for the 5th infringement, 5 seconds for the 6th infringement, and so on. Aston Martin did something similar in Austria at the sprint. They also went there afterwards and said, wait a minute, race control, you haven't penalized all infringements as you should have. However, Aston Martin was clever enough to do this immediately after the race, i.e. to lodge a protest against the result as such. That is no longer possible in this case. It was far too long ago, which is why Haas made use of this right of review. But you have to present new and significant evidence to do so, and that's where it could fail. We have seen this right of review many times in the past, but what is new and what is significant, the stewards then have to judge this, and only if they say that the evidence Haas has now presented is new and significant, i.e. it fulfills both requirements, will the case be reopened, and only then can penalties be imposed. What could such new and significant evidence be? Some people believe that it was media sessions from Mexico. Lando Norris, for example, has said that it is clever if you know that the track limits are not being monitored when you take advantage of that. Others say onboard cameras, most of which are available during the race, but Alexander Albon also had to be acquitted due to a lack of evidence. So it's going to be a very tricky matter. On the one hand, I can of course understand Haas. If there is a rule, it should of course be adhered to. On the other hand, it is of course also unfair if there is no warning from the race director, and therefore it doesn't mean, wait a minute, you have already broken the track limits 3 times, now there will be a penalty next time. If there is no warning at all and then I get 10 penalties afterwards, that's not in the spirit of the rules either. Of course, this whole situation with the track limits is not in the spirit of the rules. I've often talked myself into a rage about it, so I'll let it go at this point. Now, I'm curious to see what happens next. We haven't yet been given a time frame by the FIA. The hearing must first take place to see whether there is any new and significant evidence. And if it goes ahead, a new hearing will have to be scheduled with the parties involved to see how they defend themselves. I am curious and hope that it will not plunge Formula One into a mid-level crisis. But now to the sport. Today we had the sprint shootout and then the sprint race itself. Max Verstappen won once again, but he only started the race from 2nd position. Lando Norris actually took pole position. Then the preliminary decision was made at the start. Verstappen passed Norris, and then it was a race that mainly revolved around tire management. That's actually not a bad thing per se. The drivers agreed that there was an incredible amount of tire management, but it's only through this tire management that you get into a situation where there are fights. because if everyone raced at full throttle from start to finish, the differences would be limited. Different tire management, different handling of the tires also leads to scraps. But Max Verstappen and Red Bull have once again shown that they are in a league of their own. At one point, it even looked as if Lando Norris could be a threat to him. At one point, he was a little bit faster than Verstappen at the front, but you could tell straight away that Verstappen was managing a bit more and was then able to pick up the pace again. Norris, on the other hand, even had to overtake George Russell once, who had got off to a good start. In the end, however, Norris crossed the finish line 4.3 seconds behind. Sergio Perez put in a strong performance today, finishing P3 in qualifying. After that, he had a bit of a difficult start lap, but worked his way back up to third position. But he also crossed the finish line 13.6 seconds behind. That's one world, Red Bull and Lando Norris, and then there's a second world, George Russell in fourth position, 26 seconds behind after 24 laps in the sprint. That's a massive gap, and you saw something quite interesting. The Mercedes tyres actually collapsed at the end, not quite as noticeably for Russell as for Lewis Hamilton, who dropped back to 7th position, 35 seconds behind at the finish, which is an even more massive gap. Even the Ferrari handled the tyres better than the black-silver Arrow, but Ferrari had a different problem. As you can see, they really struggled against the AlphaTauris of Yuki Tsunoda and Daniel Ricciardo. For one reason, they made a mistake with the cooling system. It was much hotter than Ferrari had anticipated, which meant that Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz had to lift and coast throughout the race, i.e. take their foot off the gas very early to keep the temperatures in check. Charles Leclerc said that he had never done that so much in his entire life, and our data actually shows that, as you can see, that Charles Leclerc even took his foot off the gas more than 200 meters before the actual braking point on many laps. He says that if that's not different in the race, then there's a real problem, because he didn't even get the tires into the right temperature window because he couldn't attack enough in the braking zone. On race Sunday, however, it should actually be much better, because the temperatures will be considerably lower, 5 or 6 degrees, which makes a big difference in Formula One. And Ferrari had another very interesting aspect. They qualified below average today because they only put on a used set of tires in the sprint shootout. Charles Leclerc also had a fresh set of tires, and in the sprint, it was said that they put on the worst set of soft tires they could find. Why? Because they would much rather keep all these tires for the Grand Prix. In the Grand Prix, Charles Leclerc will start from second position. In case you've forgotten, I don't blame you, and you want to have the best possible tires available. So I'm curious to see if this strategy works for the Scuderia. If you still haven't had enough of Ferrari, of the legendary brand, then we have something very special for you. A special video about the Ferrari World Final. My colleague Robert Seibert was at the Finale Mondiali in Mugello and gives you some really great impressions of the event in Italy, including of a very exotic car, Ferrari hypercar for 5 million euros, of the Ferrari challenge cars and much more, so be sure to check out this video. There was actually one big upset away from track limits, even before the sprint race, namely in the sprint shootout. Esteban Ocon and Fernando Alonso got into each other's way at the end of SQ1, and there was actually a collision between those two drivers. When I say sprint shootout, perhaps for those who aren't quite so familiar with the term, it's the qualifying for the sprint race. Fernando Alonso had just completed his fast lap and was on his in-lap back into the pit lane. Esteban Ocon was on his final attempt, went through the Senna S at the Autodromo Jose Carlos Paz in Interlagos, and then the two of them collided relatively roughly at turn 3 in the Curva do Sol. Fernando Alonso drove a little off the racing line to the outside to let Ocon past. Esteban Ocon on the inside, of course he was pushing hard in his Alpine. It was his qualifying lap. It was all about getting through to SQ2. He lost the car very slightly, lost the rear of his Alpine car and corrected it. Fernando Alonso is already heading back towards the racing line at this very moment, and then Esteban Ocon hit Fernando Alonso, right rear tire against Fernando Alonso's left front wheel. Ocon crashed, even hitting the tire stack relatively hard. The sprint shootout had to be interrupted for 24 minutes because the crash barrier and the tire stack had to be repaired. For him, of course, the shootout was over. For Fernando Alonso too, who was able to limp back to the pits and qualified for SQ2, but was then unable to take part due to the damage. Who was to blame for that? I think that's a really interesting discussion. The stewards in Interlagos looked at it and said neither of the two drivers were at fault, so neither Esteban Ocon nor Fernando Alonso. Ocon lost the car a bit, Alonso pulled back onto the racing line, so it wasn't really clear, no further action. Esteban Ocon and Fernando Alonso obviously had a completely different view of the situation. Ocon had already radioed out of the car, that damn idiot Fernando, then of course added later in the media sessions, saying, wait a minute, I was on a qualifying lap and others also lost the car a bit in the corner and made corrections, including Lando Norris in his McLaren on his pole lap. Fernando Alonso, on the other hand, says, wait a minute, I drove off the racing line and the other guy lost the car, so it's clear who's to blame from his point of view. I'm really looking forward to hearing your opinions. We've discussed this a lot in the editorial team. Personally, I think that the whole thing is really down to Fernando Alonso. Why? I think he should drive away more clearly and not pull over again so early. Of course, Ocon lost the car a bit, but in my opinion, he has every right to make this slight correction because it was his qualifying lap. On his qualifying lap, nobody should actually stand in his way. Why shouldn't he be allowed to push so hard that he has to make a slight correction? Well, you've also seen it with others. It wasn't an unusual incident. That's why, in my opinion, he has every right to push hard and make a few corrections. Fernando Alonso, the experienced driver, should, in my opinion, have been a bit more cautious and simply left the door open for longer. I'm really curious to see what you have to say in the comments. So that was it, the sixth and final sprint of the 2023 Formula One season. Many were not really happy afterwards. In the top three press conference, there were actually relatively long expressions, although everyone could have been happy. Verstappen once again won a sprint, 4 out of 6 of which he won. Lando Norris in second position, well, you slowly get used to it, but still a good result for him. Perez finally back again. But somehow they all had something to criticize, including the rules. We've been discussing the new rules at the pit lane exit in qualifying for the last few days. You're now allowed to keep your distance up to the safety car line too. You can slow down to make a gap. That caused trouble again today. Yesterday there were already 3 penalties, 3 times plus 2 positions on the grid for Sunday. Today on Sprint Saturday there were some investigations again for delta times. In the end, Lando Norris got a warning for that, and there was a bit of trouble again about the pit lane exit, what was going on there. Max Verstappen, the world champion, said that this rule is just absolutely terrible, that you can only do the gap there now. Why is that? In Brazil, you have a relatively long pit exit and there's still a wall in between. But on other tracks, there's no wall between the racetrack and the pit exit. And then you drive very slowly and on the start and finish straight. Some cars drive next to you at 300 km/h and much higher speeds. That can lead to really dangerous situations. At least that's Max Verstappen's opinion. I'm curious, this is a new rule. The stewards have already realized that it's not quite ideal, but they can't find anything better at the moment. Can't you really find anything better? I'm curious. On the other hand, of course, you prevent the dangerous situation at the end of the lap where everyone keeps their distance before the last corner and others finish their fast lap right there. So the way you do it is somehow wrong. Personally, I think it looks a bit stupid with the current rules, but I still think it's safer than the old rules. But these maximum delta times, which now apply not only to in-laps but also to out-laps, also lead to investigations time and again. It's quite annoying for us to keep an eye on that. Then there's the constant waiting for the results. With Lando Norris, it was of course a special case as to why he got the warning. It wasn't just about outlaps and the gap, but someone else had finished another lap and was already on the track. It's a slightly more complicated case, but it really is a very, very stupid case. We've already discussed it with Charles Leclerc, who brought it up. So we definitely need to find better solutions, but that wasn't the only reason why the drivers were unhappy. It was also about the sprint as such. This was the 6th sprint race of this season. There have been a lot of sprints recently, Qatar, Aston, and now Brazil. Somehow nobody really warms to it. Neither the drivers, as Max Verstappen has said many times, it's absolutely nothing for him. He says, there's no need to change the format of this sprint format, just have a normal Grand Prix weekend. Others are still looking for a better solution, for the perfect sprint with reverse grids and so on. When I hear reverse grids, I feel a bit sick, and that actually shows that we are going in the wrong direction. But the drivers have complained that they have nothing to say. Yes, they are listened to, but the decision is made by others. Among others, the team bosses, and they have completely different interests than the drivers. What is your perfect sprint format? For me, I'm a bit in the camp of Max Verstappen. There isn't really a perfect sprint format for me. I need this progression of practice 1, practice 2, practice 3, qualifying, and then the Grand Prix. Am I somehow too old? Who knows? I'm curious. You're a bit younger than me as a rule. What do you want to see? Do you want these sprints? Do you have a better idea of how the whole thing could be organized? Let us know in the comments. But it has to be said that the team bosses aren't really in love with this format either. There are already more and more voices saying that it's not quite ideal. Christian Horner said afterwards that it somehow feels as if you've done a long run and would get a medal for it after the sprint, so there's not much love there either. It doesn't matter, we'll see the Grand Prix tomorrow. It's all set if you want to catch up on the latest news, including the starting grid and much more. I don't blame you if you've forgotten. That's what Motorsport-Magazin.com is for. Either type it into your browser in the traditional way if you're old-fashioned like me, although I already have our app, or go to your cell phone and download it for free for Android and iOS.